So the first question was, I'd like to see graphics and map for the Grand Avenue Gateway Zone. So I have the one graphic here of that sub-district, and I think they're talking about just the corner of Grand and Route 66. So this is the Grand Avenue Gateway sub-district. I mean, I'll leave this up. We do have, the zoning map is on the city's website. If you want to see the boundaries for any zoning district within the city, you can do a search for zoning map, and it'll give you that for that district or any other. We hear the project on Route 66 in Glendora is 6 stories, and it's not. The buildings around, there's a parking structure in the middle, which is a 5-level parking structure with rooftop parking. And the 6th story is the roof. The buildings or the townhomes themselves or apartments are 3 and 4 stories. So the building is not 6 stories. Okay. With all the references to considering adjacent buildings, how does Avalon Bay meet that? And I think this is a question about, one of the comments we've got is that it's completely out of character for the area. How did such a big building, and again, I think with the specific plan, one of the intents of it was to incentivize development, to have higher density development, and to transform the area around the Gold Line station. So it does represent, I think, a shift in land policy going back to 2003. And I know that that's really what is causing a lot of the concerns. I should probably put these here as I answer them. Why didn't you make the developer of the Avalon Bay project honor height limits? The city will attract developers who will honor these rules, not defy them. And again, I think the height of that structure is within the limitations of the Route 66 specific plan and the town center mixed use subdistrict. The subdistrict allows, it allows with the development incentives as much as a 5-story building and up to 60 feet tall. And that building is somewhat shorter than that. It's about 45 feet. The parking structure at its highest point is about 62 feet tall. So it does meet the height limits of the Route 66 specific plan. Although, again, I admit it's tall and it represents a change from the past. What was the rationale for such, dense housing? And again, I think I've partly answered this question talking about the Route 66 specific plan. One of the reasons was for economic development. As I kind of explained earlier through the presentation, I think the folks back 15 years ago understood or believed that in order to have a restaurant row or more commercial, that we needed to get housing in order to incentivize, to have enough people here to support more of that. And then also at the specific plan, particularly around the Gold Line station, the idea was to develop transit-oriented development, to have more people around that area to strengthen the commercial, to have more people to support the village, and also achieve the goals of having nearby riders like a lot of cities are doing for the future Gold Line. Could the present city council have fought the density and height of the Avalon Bay project? I think, to some degree, yes. But I think one of the key things, whenever a property owner comes to the city, and they come to me and they say, I own this piece of property, I want to know what I can do. And you go to the development standards, and the development standards, well, it says you can build a building this high, and it can be this close to the street, and it has to have this many parking spaces. And in the case of the Route 66 plan, if you do certain things, if you consolidate parcels, and if you include mixed use, you get additional height and density bonuses. So from the council's perspective, when they're reviewing a project and they say, well, does it not exceed the limits of the density? Is the development supported by what the code says? Then while they can tweak architecture and roof line design and sort of things like that to massage the project, step this part back a little bit, this part goes down a little bit, the developer has or the property owner developer has a right because of the land use policies we set in place to do certain things. What does massing mean? Usually massing in the zoning code is an architectural term, and it relates to the size and volume of a building. When you're talking about massing, sometimes it also refers to, you're talking about how do you minimize the massing. So you have a big building, what can you do to the architecture of the building in order to minimize or alter the way the massing looks? Can you make part of it shorter? Can you push a part of it back? And it really relates to tweaking around the architectural edges. Here's another question. The code says side setbacks of 10 feet for the first 2 stories above ground and 5 feet for each foot or each additional story. So how does Avalon Bay fit that? And I think that refers to the side yard setback in Avalon Bay. These are we had new questions about the development standards were going to come up. So the side yard setback is 0 feet, but when it's abutting residential, that's where this language comes from. 10 feet for the first 2 stories above ground level, thereafter 5 additional. And so the Avalon Bay, the side setback where the property line meets another property line is adjacent to Foothill Christian. It's not adjacent to residential. So it can be up to the property line. It doesn't have to comply with those additional setbacks. If it was adjacent to a residential, then it would. Can we change the definition of a story? And maybe the definition, Dave wants to elaborate on this, the definition of a story, it really comes from the building code. So I'll have him, and that can't be changed because the building code we don't set, but anyway, I'll have him answer that question.
Good evening. The definition of a story is contained in the California Building Code, which is adopted as law by the city. It's also contained in our zoning code, which is also adopted. And the definition states that a story has a floor and a roof above it. So anything like this is a story. Anything above it would have to have a roof for it to be a second story. And the parking garage is a perfect example. Although there are 6 levels of parking, there are only 5 stories because the top level doesn't have a roof.
So the next question is, does the Route 66 specific plan say that a building cannot be taller than 5 stories? And it does in one section for a particular subdistrict. There's one section of the town center mixed use subdistrict where it does say that in the design guidelines. In the development standards with the development incentives attached, it says that it can be up to 5 stories. In either case, with respect to the Avalon Bay project, I think you could argue that the parking structure is 5 stories, but the buildings around it are only 4. But my interpretation is that with the development standards the way they're written, if they take advantage of the development incentives, a building could be up to 5 stories in that sub-district. And it's the only sub-district where a building could be that tall. I think the rest of them the tallest you could get is 4. Are there any benefits to the community from this development? Well, I think obviously I talked a little bit about direct financial benefits, permit fees paid, increased property taxes, and I think we have a slide about the financial benefits for this project. So sum total to both the city and the schools, annual property tax just shy of $3 million. Those are sort of hard numbers. A lot of them is one-time money. I mean, I think the longer-term benefit is, one, achieving the goals of the specific plan that we set out for ourselves, and having more folks in the area to support a lot of the economic development objectives that the specific plan had.
Let me give you a break for a second.
Sure.
There was one question, could the present city council have fought the density and height of the Avalon Bay project? Jeff touched upon that, but because I'm the city attorney, let me try to expand on that a tad bit. You got to remember, this specific plan sets forth the rules and regulations for development along that corridor. And it sends a message out to the development community: if I build within the four corners of those guidelines, I'll get a project. So the specific plan has height and density parameters. It also provides for, as Jeff said, incentives. If they consolidate properties, they get development incentives. In that case, they consolidated 13 different parcels, most of which were irregular parcels. So the language in the code on the incentives doesn't give the city council wiggle room. It doesn't give them discretion. It doesn't give them the ability to arbitrarily say no to those incentives. If the applicant says, I've consolidated 13 parcels, per your code, I'm entitled to get those incentives, because the language is shall. The city shall grant them that. So based upon what the many years of review, $500,000 spent for all the consultants to prepare that plan and have the council adopt it back in 2003, current council, because that is the law, and you can't change the law when there's a development application in process, because then you're looking at a lawsuit of a taking by the owner developer. So to answer the question specifically, could this present city council have said, no, we don't like the height? I don't think so. No, we don't like the density? I don't think so. Why? It complied with what the law adopted back in 2003 prescribed.
Hi, good evening. The one question, with low-income housing, won't we have more crime? First of all, Avalon Bay is not low-income housing. These apartments are going to be market cost. They're not going to be cheap to live in. It's not low-cost housing. None of the projects currently before the council, any of the projects that are going on right now, whether it's Gables or the station or where Naked Juice is low income. But in terms of crime, I think anyone choosing to live in Glendora, whether you're low income, middle income, wealthy, I think those who choose to live in Glendora are basically good people, with the small minority who would ever consider committing a crime. With that said, we have, in the city of Glendora, the Glendora Police Department, we're prepared. We've been preparing for these type of developments. In this last budget, first year as chief, for the first time since 2006, I went to the city council and we actually increased the number of police officers here in Glendora. We went from 51 full-time sworn to 52 full-time sworn, from a high in about 2005 to, I believe it was 58 or 59 police officers. We're at 52. For a community like Glendora, a middle-class, primarily residential community, we look to be about one police officer for every 1,000 people. And so for 52 sworn, we're about where we're at. In terms of crimes, crime is, for the last 5 years, has actually been relatively steady, plus or minus about 3%, except for last year, 2014. In Glendora, crime went down about 7%. And so once Avalon Bay comes in, I think the better question to ask is, do you expect crime to go up? And a better question is, how do we manage an additional 500 people added to our population of about, 52,000 people here in Glendora? And so we at the Glendora Police Department, we look at crime statistics, we look at traffic collisions, those numbers, both injury and non-injury. We look at the number of calls and the number of crimes and response times. And we take that into account, and we look at those numbers and plan accordingly. And so in terms of more crime, the answer is that nothing is more important than the safety of the residents of Glendora, and we at the Glendora Police Department are committed to your safety.
I have a question. What about 15 years from now when it's not a new apartment anymore and you've got blocks and they can't charge $2,000 a month for those apartments? Then what is the police department going to be facing?
And we have questions. What we're going to do is finish the questions. To be fair, everyone's got them written down, but the question real quick, and I'll address it. 15 years from now, what's going to happen? What's the Glendora Police Department going to do about Avalon Bay? And I can tell you that there are many, many apartment complexes in Glendora. You know, the fact that people live in apartment complexes, I don't think there's very many people in this room can say that they've never lived in an apartment complex. And an apartment complex doesn't mean criminality. It just doesn't. And so we've got many, many apartment complexes in Glendora that were built in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And they continue to be, you know, the residents are good, law-abiding people.
So I have a couple questions about low-income housing. There's been a lot of talk about low-income housing. What has the council approved? And there are three low-income housing projects that are in the city of Glendora. One and two of them are senior citizen-only projects. One of them is the Glendora Gardens, which is up on Bennett and next to the Bougainvillea project, if you're familiar with that area. The second one is Heritage Oaks Apartments, where 47 of the 150 units are set aside for low income. And then the third one is the Elwood Apartments on the corner of Elwood and Route 66, which is 100% low and very low income housing on that location. So those are the only, and a lot of people ask about Section 8, and I just looked this up yesterday there. Because we have to apply for a federal grant that requires, you know, us knowing how many Section 8 units are in the city, and were 51 Section 8 units in the city as of last year. If I don't live within 500 feet, how can I know about developments? Well, now with the modern age of technology, as opposed to 10 or 15 years ago, there's lots of ways. You can go onto the city's website if you want. The city has an RSS feed, and that will automatically notify you via email of any public hearing you know, that occurs in the city. You know, if you're interested in the Route 66 specific plan, we're taking a list today, and we'll probably be developing a list of folks who are interested in that. So there are lots of ways if you're not within the required noticed area, to find out about development that's going on. Why can't the city just say, no, we're not going to give the bonuses? I have a number of questions about density bonuses. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how those work. Density bonuses are one of the things in the Route 66 specific plan that grants a property owner or developer more height and more density of a project if they do different things. And the two main things that really grant the additional height bonuses are if they provide mixed use with the project, if it's in one of the zones that permits mixed use, and if they consolidate parcels as part of the development. One of the things the framers of the plan did is they inserted language to make that it shall be granted if the applicant does these things. They didn't make it discretionary. They did not make it so we get to say yes or no to the bonuses. And here's the language directly out of the code where it's, you know, the following incentives shall be made, shall being the operative word. It's not a may. So the way we read it, and I think the city attorney would agree, that we don't have discretion over not granting those bonuses if the applicant does the things that are required of the bonus. Were variances or exceptions made to any project approved? Any project, and I guess I'll limit it to the Route 66 specific plan projects, and no variances were granted for any project that have been approved in the Route 66 specific plan. It includes Avalon Bay, it includes the Glendora Station, it includes the Laterra or the Gables project, which is starting construction. The city says traffic has gone down on Route 66. How did you reach that conclusion? Maybe I'll let the Public Works Director. You've got 3 here. You can answer these 2 as well. But do the traffic one first.
So when we get a development in, we require a traffic analysis. We look at the movement, we do traffic counts, and then we look at what the development is going to add to the traffic using national and state standards, and then we calculate what the difference is, and then we would implement any mitigation measures that would help reduce that. For example, the addition of a right turn lane westbound on to Glendora on Route 66 with the current project on Route 66 in Glendora, and the extended taking out of a portion of the median to extend the left turn lane to reduce so that we can have a longer queue without backing into the lanes where the traffic isn't turning left. If you could show the next one, please. And it's a good question about the these are actual studies that were done in the same area, and you can see that some do increase, some actually decrease, and we attribute that to several things. Certainly, we've gone through a drastic change in our economy. We've had the 210 freeway extended. We have gas prices that have skyrocketed, and I think people are more cognizant of how much they're going to drive. More people carpool than they used to, but these are from actual traffic studies in the same area. So you can see that some remain very close to the same, some did increase, and some actually decreased. We also have a very stable population. So given those factors, that's how we got the results from the same type of traffic study in terms of traffic counts that were done on those 2 different times. Question, how do we get water for the new residents? That's one we hear a lot. There's not going to be any stopping development in this valley, excuse me, and we draw water from the same aquifer that our neighbors do. So we have a program in place where if a residential development comes in, we charge a fee for them to either give us water rights and or for us to go out and purchase them on the open market that will support that development. And what that does is, and we're the only agency in the valley that does that. So if these developments were going in Azusa, that water's coming from the same place we're getting our water from. If they develop in Glendora, we're at least getting a cost to go buy those rights so we can draw that water, and we're getting paid to do that. The other thing is we're protecting the existing residents by doing this. If a project comes in, we pump 80%, on average, 80% of our water out of the ground, and we purchase 20% on average. So if a development comes in, and we obviously would have to purchase more water. So by getting the fees to go out and get the water rights and or actual water rights, which we sometimes receive, that development keeps the purchased water rate down. We don't have to buy more purchased water. We hear that the fire department cannot drive trucks into the parking garage, so how can a car fire be put out? Well, it is designed, and the fire department did a very extensive review on it. They do have equipment that gets into the garage, and inside the garage there are additional standpipes for firefighting as well as on the roof. So the project is, and the entire, both buildings, the parking garage and the residential structure, have automatic fire sprinklers. They're also built of 1 hour construction throughout, which is a very restrictive fire restriction, very expensive to build. So what happens when a development like this comes in, the building code requires the 1 hour construction the proper exiting to get out of the building, how many elevators, how many stairways. The fire department comes in and determines what they need for access, how much water we actually help them calculate how much water they need, and then where the standpipes go so they can fight fires and have access to all areas of the building.
The next question on the planning side, it does not seem like the community was involved in the development of the Route 66 specific plan. I've already sort of mentioned that before. There was the Alasta Corridor Committee of about 25 residents going back to the late 90s. There was then the Route 66 Specific Plan Review Committee, which I think was about 7 or 8 citizens. There were many public meetings, at least 10 that I can document and know about relative to the review and adoption of the specific plan. So it was a big thing going on in the community when it was developed, and there were a lot of people involved. And I'll also say, you know, even because I think after it started getting constructed, the parking structure first for the Avalon Bay project, people were like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? I didn't hear anything about it. You know, and in fact, there were 3 planning commission meetings reviewing that project, asking different questions, and then 1 city council meeting. So there were 4 public meetings on that. And I know if you're not within that 500-foot area, you don't get it. But again, that's what occurred. As you mentioned that the Planning Commission is going to start reviewing the Route 66 specific plan, what does that mean, and how will the public be notified? So yeah, we're going to start after this, taking these questions and cobbling them together and giving them to the Planning Commission and start going through the specific plan. And my expectation is in some great level of detail through every section and facet of it starting in April. The Planning Commission currently meets once a month to review zoning applications, but I think we're going to be starting, much to their chagrin, meeting twice a month, and 1 meeting will be dedicated exclusively to the Route 66 specific plan for some time. In terms of how folks are notified, obviously those meetings are at a basic level publicly noticed, but again, I think I mentioned the RSS feed that you can sign up for via the city's website. You can sign in here and indicate your desire to be notified via email about those meetings. So those are a couple of different ways that you can do that. Can't the city prohibit a property owner from developing his property to bigger? Okay, can't the city prohibit a property owner from developing his property to bigger, better, like the mobile home park being turned into condos? Again, I think that in that particular, for the Gables project, it did involve the closure of a mobile home park. So there were people displaced as a result of that project. That project was a private transaction between the private property owner and the developer of the property. The city, can't tell a property owner to that degree what they can and can't do with their property. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Wayne, at all.
Was that eminent domain?
No, it was not. It was not.
Well, as a property owner, you have rights, and you have a right to build in accordance with the law of the city. So if you want to build something that exceeds the law, then the city can deny it or require that it be scaled back so it complies with whatever our laws and regulations are. But if, as the property owner, you want to build on your property that you've invested money on, and it complies with our laws and rules and regulations, you're entitled to do that. If the city prohibits you from doing that, guess what? The city may have to buy your property. That's called inverse condemnation. And we've been subject to a couple of lawsuits. Remember the Hillside Project NJD? Well, they sued us 5 times. They were unsuccessful. 2 of those, they were seeking over $20 million because we denied their project. The difference on that one, they were seeking changes in the general plan, changes in the zoning code to accommodate their higher density project, much higher than what our current zoning allowed. So that kind of gives you a little bit of example, both sides of that argument. How come the city was not sued when the Bonnie Cove and Gladstone project was stopped? Well, that's not on Route 66 specific plan, but let me respond to that one. I'm not sure what the writer means by when the project was stopped. That had to do with a senior living project down on Bonnie Cove in Gladstone that a prior city council had approved. And it wasn't stopped, it was approved by that prior city council, and there was a lawsuit challenging that approval. The individual that filed that lawsuit lost in the trial court. They then filed an appeal. They lost in the Court of Appeals. So I guess that's the answer to that question. Does the specific plan violate the integrity of the general plan? The general plan is kind of the city's land use Bible. It sets the goals and policies and objectives for what the city wants to do zoning-wise. The specific plan or the other portions of the zoning code are the implementing document that implements those goals, policies, and objectives. With respect to 2003, when our specific plan was adopted, the City Council made specific findings that that specific plan was consistent with the general plan goals and objectives. Why would the City Council fear a lawsuit from a developer if they turned down a project that did not adhere to the Route 66 specific plan, as we've heard regarding the Avalon project? Well, I think you've heard that the Avalon Bay project did comply with our rules and regulations. If it did not, hypothetically, if it did not, the council would have been within their discretion to deny it. But because it did comply, then they could go ahead and approve it.
One more, that's pretty middle. Tag you out.
And this one doesn't relate to our plan.
Next one, the Huntington Drive plan in Monrovia has no buildings over 3 stories except for the hotel next to the 210 freeway. Why don't we limit new development to 3 stories in Glendora? And I think I'll take that as a comment for the Planning Commission to consider, you know, as they look at the Route 66 specific plan, but if someone's interested in 3 stories. Why go with a developer who does not respect or hold to the historic and aesthetic principles of the community? Well, I think there's 2 parts to this question, and actually this is sometimes people, I think sometimes there's a lot of people, I get the sense that believe that the city chooses who develops private property. That we see the corner of, Glendora and Route 66 and we say, well, we're gonna go to developer X and we're gonna tell them to buy the property and then, dictate all these things. And really our role is a referee. We don't choose who owns property. We don't choose which developer buys property. That simply happens as a result of the private market. Now, the property owners and developers do come to us and they say, city, acting in your referee role, what will you let us do? What will you support? This is what I want to do, and then they either, they make a decision based on that. So we don't choose, the fact that Avalon Bay was the company that bought that property, we didn't choose Avalon Bay. They acquired the property, from the previous owner. Who does not respect or hold to the historic principles of the community. And I think that really, historic and aesthetic principles that we're trying to follow and achieve, I think that's our job. In part staff, the decision makers, planning commission and city council, and built into, I understand that there's probably wide interpretations of what the community's historic and aesthetic principles are. So that's something that as new development comes in and we try to manage and direct growth, that is among the biggest challenges that we have in the planning department with the planning commission. What does it say about a city council that breaks the rules set by a previous council? And again, I think we've answered this in a few different ways about whether projects required variances or violated the code and the projects didn't violate the code. The specific plan, really allows some relatively dramatic changes within the context of its development standards, and in some case, and it encourages those changes, so no variances were granted for those projects. Why didn't the city council tell the developer to move on to the next city? Is the city of Glendora so desperate for income that it allows developer to break the rules set by the city? You know, I get the sentiment behind the question. You know, I mean, it's, you know, we're seeing some dramatic changes, I think. We can't, you want to answer the question about telling them to move on? Or?
Well, again, it gets back to property rights, and it gets back to the question, did they break the rules or did they comply with the rules? They didn't break the rules. And again, those rules were set back in 2003 by a prior city council after substantial community input. It wasn't done in a vacuum. I think what's important for tonight, and for you folks that have invested your time and effort to come out tonight, this is the start of a review of that plan. Okay? Is it still viable? And so those answers, those questions will be answered hopefully over the next months, maybe years, with Planning Commission input, with your input, and hopefully we'll come up with an answer that maybe it'll be changed, maybe it won't, maybe it'll be tweaked a little bit, maybe a lot, we don't know. But this is the start of the process that the City Council has said, get started on it. Let's look at it, okay? So the council is understanding that this is a dynamic document. It might need to be changed. As time goes by, we'll look at it, and that's what we're doing. So your input tonight, your questions are very important, and we're taking notes of all these questions. And hopefully when the Planning Commission gets a stab at this over the next several months, they'll take those questions very seriously and analyze the viability. But there's a lot of other questions to look at. Part of the reason why there's these incentives is we want to entice development into our town. You can't do that. Well, do you want the mobile home parks there forever? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Those are policy questions that have to be answered. Back in 2003, the community said, we want to make some changes. Maybe you don't want to see that in the future. That's why we're here tonight.
Can I ask just one verbal question to that?
Sure.
Do you think that now the council's starting to get that maybe we should have a vote on some of this stuff where we actually, as a city, get to have our input, not just a small group of us sitting in this room, but actually give the people a chance to voice whether or not some of these projects go through? Because this is our city.
Well, yeah, I can't answer for what the council's...
Repeat the question, Wayne.
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand it, other than I think he's suggesting that shouldn't the citizens have a chance to vote on these things?
On a big project like this, yes.
In a way you do, when you vote for your council persons, okay? That's what representative government is for.
Question we have here, do we have the fire and police coverage for all this new development? In terms of fire coverage, we, of course, contract with the Los Angeles County Fire Department, the finest fire department in the entire world, in my humble opinion. We have 4 fire stations. We actually have 3 fire stations within the city limits. The one, Amelia and Route 66, one on Gladstone, 151, just a couple of blocks over. We also have 97, which is just right on the border on Sierra Madre, just in the county area, just right on below the Garcia Trail. And so in terms of fire coverage, it's outstanding. In terms of police coverage, I would say that Glendora continues to be one of the safest, if not the safest cities in the San Gabriel Valley. I can say that with a lot of pride. We have 52 officers. We have 6 reserve officers. I have a total of 83 full-time employees. I have part-time employees. I have I have volunteers that work at the police department. This is a very safe city, and that's our top priority, the council's top priority. It is my only job is to make sure Glendora residents are safe. There's some other questions on here about water and such. I'll give it to the others. Just as a reminder, if you do have questions, comments, please put them on these 3x5 cards. Again, we've got a lot to get through. Till 9 o'clock, please. Thank you.
I'll just make one comment about on big projects, shouldn't the community vote on something? And I think there's always a feeling whenever big projects are done that somebody or a group of people always say, gosh, I didn't hear about it, or how come I didn't hear, how come nobody asked me about this? And we do a lot to try to get, in terms of the noticing and availability of information on the website for projects. I think looking at it, one of the things that I think the community should consider if we're going to have vote on big projects is if you want economic development, if you want some new stuff to replace old stuff over time, how would a private investor or a property owner view that in terms of their willingness to spend the time and money that it takes to get through the development process if they knew that they would also be subject to a vote of the entire community? Because that adds a tremendous amount of additional risk and possible financial loss to a property owner. And like I always like to tell developers, you're dealing with some degree, even coming in on a discretionary project, with an 11-headed monster, or at least probably a 15-headed monster.
We're not talking about the development, we're talking about voting on the Route 66.
Okay, I understood that gentleman's question about being about particular big projects. Oh, okay. That's a different issue. Then,
Zoning.
right. That's a different and something to consider. Again, the similar question about variances: were there any variances granted in order to accommodate setbacks, height limits, and landscaping requirements? And no. On the projects in Route 66, there have not been any variances granted for anything for height setbacks. And again, it's worth saying that I know it's different than previous development that has occurred in parts of the city. But again, I think the folks were really trying to, create some level of transformation and revitalization that depended on, and it's stated in different places in the specific plan about placing buildings at the street, in many cases, really encouraging it to be on the street versus having any setback at all. And then, working with the height and mass of the building to try to fit that in. But again, they felt that was a way to encourage you. Put the entrances to the building nearest to the sidewalk, nearest transit. You're encouraging more pedestrian activity. Kind of like, imagine the Village. The Village is exactly sort of a lower scale version of what they were trying to achieve with Route 66, because it's walkable. You can walk into the stores. There's some residential. Maybe someday there will be more residential, but that is the idea. What happens to the school fees that have been referenced by the city? So the fees that the school district collects, I want to make that clear. A lot of people think the city oversees the schools. The city does not oversee the schools. The school district has its own elected body, the school board. So when they collect those fees, I know that they're governed by state law with respect to what they do with them. I can't speak for the school district. Does anybody have any special insight with regard to what the schools do with their fees?
I deal with the schools just about on a weekly basis. And again, we can't speak for Glendora Unified, Charter Oak Unified School Districts, but speaking with Dr. Vors, speaking with Dr. Hendricks, pupils are the school's commodity, and they need kids to stay in business. And we all know just a few years ago, one of the finest elementary schools in Glendora, Williams School on Lorraine, closed. And it closed because of the lack of attendance. We're an older community, empty nesters. When the house is empty with kids, Glendora residents like to stay in Glendora. They don't move somewhere else for retirement. They stay here. And so there was less kids. They had to actually close Williams School. They also had to start a program to encourage more kids to come to Glendora, district of choice. You've heard that before. Glendora schools were built for and designed for Glendora kids. We see that common. My school resource officer, in dealing with kids, will run into kids from the Inland Empire that have problems at say, Glendora High School, or there could be problems with kids that live west of the 605. And so by having, I know from my conversations with the two superintendents, they want more residents in Glendora. They need those kids to come to Glendora schools.
How or what are we going to spend the parks fees on? Well, those fees, could you pull up the last slide on the fees, please? The park fees, for a good example, will go to develop and enhance our existing parks and to develop new parks. Big Tree Park is an example where this year we have a project where we've purchased the property adjacent to the park. We will be demolishing that house and expanding the size of that park, but that's a perfect example of where those park development fees go. And the fees that are listed here are for the 5 major projects that are going on right now, and you can see that the park development fees just for these 5 projects is over $1.2 million. About 10 years ago, our planning department and the consulting firm RBF gave a presentation. They told us that residential development no longer pays for itself. Can you provide or point to a fiscal impact analysis? And I think this tells a pretty good story. Probably the most significant is the public improvements. Those are improvements that the developer pays for. So with these 5 projects, there's over $9 million in public improvements being done. Streets, sidewalks, parkways, water, sewer, storm drain, street lighting, and the developer is paying for that. If you look at the back to the school fees, that just tells you what just these 5 developments are bringing in that go to the school. I don't want to repeat, but someone is asking again about traffic. Please feel free to get on our Public Works Engineering website. The actual traffic reports are on there. I won't say that they're very fun to read, but they do have a ton of information. And also, is the fire department prepared to deal with the parking garage? Yes. We have 2 questions here about street lights, and since that's a little off topic, one is about our antique street lights and one is about solar streetways. More than happy to answer the question, but that's really not what we're here to talk about tonight. So if those that ask those questions would be kind enough to provide your contact information to the table out back, I'll be happy to answer that question, and or you're more than welcome to come and see me in the Public Works Department.
So the next question, more of a, but the PowerPoint, I guess actually we have different PowerPoints, is this available online at the city's website? And not at the moment, but we can certainly do that. My feeling is that one of the things we'll be doing as we get into the Route 66 specific plan update is probably having a dedicated web page on the progress, on minutes from all those meetings, probably a link to videos from all those meetings. For those of you who don't know, every meeting of the Planning Commission is streamed live, and every video of the commission going back at least, I think, about 7 or 8 years is still there. If you want to go back and look at a meeting from 2008, like I did earlier today for something, then you can do that. Actually, it's pretty handy. Define negative impact report. How can one development be deemed negative impact when it's being built near another development? There is an obvious appearance of an impact. And I think what this question refers to is the California Environmental Quality Act, which we call CEQA as the acronym for that. And really what they're referring to, there's different levels of review under the Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. There's called a categorical exemption, meaning you're exempt from further review under CEQA, and there's something called a negative declaration, mitigated negative declaration, and then the highest level of review is an environmental impact report. And I think people are most familiar with that. A negative declaration means that the city has analyzed, or the lead agency has analyzed it and determined that the project does not have any impacts that are significant which cannot be mitigated. And I'll give you an example, because I'll give you the Avalon Bay example. Mr. Davies talked about the traffic impact analysis. One of the studies that was done for that project was a traffic impact analysis. Actually, there was probably the traffic engineer analyzed a lot of different intersections as a result of that application. There were mitigations to reduce the impact of that project below a level of significance that were applied to that project. Likewise, that project is also near a railroad that it includes heavy rail, even though it only goes by twice a day, and it will include light rail. And so there was a noise and vibration impact study to determine what impacts the noise and vibration would have on the project and what the developer had to do in terms of the construction techniques to use to mitigate those impacts. So if you can mitigate impacts, then under those various studies that you do, you can adopt a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration. It doesn't mean that when the city does adopt those things that we did not consider environmental impacts. It just means if an EIR, if it rises to the level of EIR, it means that there was something about the project which could not be mitigated below a level of significance. That's when you do an EIR. For example, if you're doing hillside development and you've got an endangered species and the development threatens an endangered species, maybe even would kill it permanently or something. Let's imagine a scenario. Then you would have to do an environmental impact report, because if you're going to kill this last species of tree or something that's in this area, it's a natural habitat, you can't replace that. That's an impact that cannot be mitigated. So that's my 2 cents, 50-second lesson on CEQA and negative declaration. So hopefully that answers the question. Why are residents of apartments or mobile home parks not notified of pending development? In other words, property owners who are within 500 feet of the project are notified, but not the residents. And that is true. The code requires, the municipal code in terms of noticing for public hearings, requires notification of property owners. And so tenants or of either businesses or units are not notified as part of those, as part of the process. And that's simply, maybe something to look at eventually, but under the current code, that is what the way the code is written.
And that's state law as well.
Yeah, so that's compliant with state law. How do we change the Route 66 plan so we don't have any more of these developments? Remove incentives? Well, that'd be one way that you could accomplish that, yes. And I think, again, the dialogue on whether or not to have another Avalon Bay or maybe residential development, but something different, will be part of what we're considering when we get to the Planning Commission and getting into looking at the specific plan. Has the Naked Juice project been approved? How many units? Where can I get more info about what is proposed and when? Okay, you're talking about that the Naked Juice property or former Rainbird property is there's over at Foothill and Grand, some old industrial property. The project covers, there is a site that was assembled by a developer covering about 8 or 9 acres of that corner. And there has been a project entitled for construction of development of that site. And that project consists of, over the about 8.5 to 9 acres, a 144 unit townhome development. To give you some perspective on, massing and sort of quantity of homes, the Avalon Bay project, in terms of density, is a 50 unit to the acre project. The project at Foothill and Grand is a 16 unit to the acre project. It's a different type. It'll be owner-occupied townhomes. It's a lot, but don't forget it's a big site. But in terms of the massing and number of density of development, it's much lower than I think what people saw on the corner of Route 66 in Glendora. Does the city have a say in the landscape of the Avalon project? If so, what does the Route 66 landscape plan look like? And it does. Yes, we do have review of the landscaping plan. And I think it's hard, people saying, where's the landscaping going to go? Where's the landscaping going to go? There are provisions made for landscaping on Route 66 and on Glendora for both trees on the edge of the sidewalk, as well as landscaping within the area between their property line where the sidewalk ends and the project itself. I think when some of the fencing comes down, as well as some of the finished architecture gets applied to the outside of the building, I think that building's going to look a lot different, and you'll sort of see. I mean, people may still say, well, it's too big, it's too close to the street, but it's not going to look like that, forever. There will be landscaping. It will be a finished product. And we do review, as part of the review of every major application, landscaping plans are a basic part of what the planning department reviews. Okay. Can the city create a development email interest list that will be sent an email notification of all major developments within 3 business days of city staff agreement with the developer on a specific project? This would be before it comes to the Planning Commission. So I guess the Planning Commission finds out about, whenever we send out a public hearing notice, that's when the Planning Commission first finds out about a project. Because at that point, that means staff has completed its review of the project. We've done whatever CEQA studies that we have to do so we have a complete application. And so that's the point at which we could notify. And if you get the RSS feed, you would receive that notification at the same time the reviewing body does. Or you can check on the city's website. All of our public hearing notices are posted on the city's website. When will the Gold Line actually reach Glendora? Well, that's a good question. Right now, the Gold Line is being constructed to a Citrus Avenue, which is just across the border in Azusa. That's supposed to be open and operational in early 2016. That they're supposed to finish construction late this year and turn it over to the construction authority, turn it over to Metro for testing, making sure it runs correctly. They don't want to have trains, hitting houses as it's going down the railway, and then it'll start construction. The next phase of that project, which includes the Glendora stop, right now. The Gold Line Authority is doing some engineering work for the actual alignment of the track and has a lot of work to do before it itself goes out to bid. It tells us last meeting that I was in with them that it's anticipating to go out to bid on that project in 2017. But nonetheless, they still don't have enough money to complete the project. So they're forging ahead, thinking positively, wanting to go out to bid in 2017. And I think they're hoping early 2020s probably, maybe by the end of this decade. But again, it depends on funding for that project. And actually, I say the end of this decade like it's a long time away, but it's only 5 years away. So how were members of the Alasta Corridor Committee and the Route 66 Committee selected and appointed? I know that the council appointed both of those bodies. I do not know how the application and interview process worked. That is not in the records that I've seen from that period.
I'll tell you that.
Okay.
The second committee members were all appointed by the council. The first committee members were selected through open process, where the entire community was invited to apply. The second committee overturned basically the first committee's recommendations.
So there you go. I mean that's more about the selection process than I knew.
I think it says a lot more than that.
I wasn't there, so I wasn't at those meetings, so I don't know how they proceeded. But there were committees, and they were, The Alasta Corridor Committee recommended increasing our daytime population by bringing in more medium-sized companies to provide jobs. The committee recommended the consolidation of small commercial lots in order to provide larger commercial lots to accommodate larger commercial buildings for larger companies. Why are we reducing the city's capacity to host those companies? And that's a point well taken. I think it was a main goal of the specific plan, keying off of what Monrovia did on East Huntington Drive to develop a tech corridor. And that's why when they rezoned the whole corridor, pretty much everything east of Pasadena is all commercial. And there's a special technology TCO subdistrict that was intended, and it really only allows Class A office development. That was the intent for that very end. And all that property was set aside. So you're asking yourself, well, why hasn't that happened? Why hasn't Nabisco or something opened a corporate office in Glendora there? Well, again, you have to have a site that's big enough for an office campus. If you're a business employing, I don't know, a few hundred people, you need a property that can accommodate, 100,000 square feet of office space. You're coming in and saying, Mr. Planning Director, do you have a 10-acre site that's available in the city that I can build on? Well, that's the problem, is that we don't have the land. And the economics of building an office building are much different than the economics of building housing in terms of what the land values are. So the financial incentive, economic incentive is not quite there yet in the eastern end of the corridor. And the land is not as easy to assemble. You have a lot of little parcels that somebody would need to get. And I think, at the time, for good or bad, the Saratoga probably would have been for an office complex, where that property is located, but it went for housing. And I'm sure there were good reasons at the time why it did, but it's hard to assemble land for it. For the most part, I like the Route 66 corridor specific plan and the redevelopment. It is encouraging. I like the maximum height specified in Chapter 6 Land Use Development regs, and they give the pages. I do not like the height bonuses allowed described on page. So this person doesn't mind the basic heights, but does not like the development incentives that allow the higher density and higher, the 4 and 5 story, the going up above 30 units to the acre, which is what you get with the incentives. If this project doesn't meet expectations, can it ultimately become a low-income property, government housing? I think that is unlikely. I mean, in terms of, given to the extent that any apartment building has become, I'm not aware of any, I don't think there's, as far as I know, I don't think there's any apartment building in the city or any property that after it was developed as a market rate property that has decided to become a low-income property. I'm not aware of that ever happening in the city of Glendora. Like I mentioned earlier, there are only 3 properties in the city that are set aside for low income. 2 of them are seniors, and they were built that way from the get-go. To convert it to low, I don't know what the incentive for the property owner would be to do that. If they have plenty of people who are willing to rent their apartments at market rate, why do they need the government to subsidize it? And nobody has done that, so I don't see that is a likely scenario. Has the Route 66 specific plan been reviewed by any city council since 2003? Comprehensively, like we're going to do now? No. So we're 12 years into it. It was intended to be a 20-year plan. That's stated in the plan. So we're about midpoint, so it's probably a good time to take a look at it anyway. What height, how many stories are the already approved buildings? Do we have a say as to whether or not these projects are built? There's a lot of questions here. Maybe I'll go one at a time. What height, how many stories are the already approved buildings? Well, I talked about Avalon Bay, 3 and 4 stories, with the parking structure being 5 stories with a rooftop parking with that. The Laterra project, or the Gables project, which is the one that's with the green fencing that's just been bulldozed, that project is 3 stories. About 20 units to the acre is what the density is. The Glendora Station project is also 3 stories, about 35 feet tall. That density of that project, those are attached townhomes, is about 18 units to the acre. And then I talked about the Glendora and Foothill project again. Same type of product as the Station project, a little bit less dense at 16 units to the acre. bigger, much bigger property, and it actually lays out better because it's not as shallow. Do we have a say as to whether or not these projects are built? I think we being the community, I think as it's reflected in the land use policies and regulations, that's where we have the say. That's the real power is that the community has is on making land use policy. How much do you want here? How big should it be? Et cetera. On individual projects, once you set those rules in place, like the city attorney has, I think, expressed a few times, the city and the community have to abide by the rules. It's not a popularity contest. I had a situation on a much smaller scale where we had an applicant wanting to do a second-story addition, and all the neighbors, immediate neighbors, were against it. They had various reasons why they were against it, but the code allows you to do a second-story addition as long as it doesn't exceed the height limits. This was the residents. This went over a series of about 3 planning commission meetings. The commission, I think, did a lot to try to mitigate the impacts on the neighbors, to try to respect things like, their privacy, the location of the set. But because it's allowed under the code, the planning commission, at the end of the day, really had to approve that project. So it's the same on projects large and small. Can we limit construction to 2 stories or less and still generate sustaining revenue? I think that's a good question. One of the things that the specific plan looked at was really what incentives and densities are going to be necessary to get investment in the area. I think that's the reason the city hired, an economist or land use economic analyst to do that review and say, okay, what do you need to do if you're going to incentivize people to cobble together all these little small pieces of property that probably already have stuff and things on it that you'll need to bulldoze, because you've got to buy the land and the building, and maybe even enough money to make the business move. So that's a good question. I think that's one of the things that ultimately we'll have to revisit and look at. Have the economics of land use changed in the last 15 years such that you can still entice, assuming you want new investment and the same kind of change, what does it take to incentivize that kind of development and do it in a way that's acceptable and supportable within the community? That's probably the toughest question. How do I get on the planning committee? And if you're talking about the planning commission, if there's a vacancy, then you can apply, and actually I think you can submit applications anytime you want to commissions to the city clerk's office. And if there's a vacancy, then your application would be considered by the council. Are we going to put together a new planning committee? And I think maybe you're talking about the Route 66 specific plan. That may be, in terms of reforming an Alasta corridor committee, that could happen. I think the first step, again, is going to be going through it with the Planning Commission, which is the council-appointed group of residents who are volunteers they're volunteering to do land use planning. I think their recommendations will be given to the council, and then probably at some point, be a council decision as to exactly what the depth and breadth of modifying or not modifying the Route 66 specific plan will be. Are we going to keep the Park Manor mobile home park next door to the Foothill Medical Center and El Amigo Mexican food place on the other side? The city doesn't own that property. Nobody from the Park Manor Mobile Home Park has approached the city on any level that I'm familiar with to close that park or do something different with it. So, as far as I know, they're happy, satisfied operating the park. Why are we not trying to rework the citrus packing facility in Glendora in a similar fashion as a packing facility in Claremont? So we're probably talking about, I understand that there is one packing house left in the city. It's been substantially altered, but it's over behind the post office. The property owner has decided to sell the property. It's about a 3-acre site. And in March, the Planning Commission will be considering an application to develop that property for condos, for detached condos. But And actually compared, so that packing house would be demolished as part of that. Now, I will say, as a historic resource, it is subject to review under the California Environmental Quality Act. So we have hired, as part of that review, a historic person firm specializing in historic preservation to evaluate the historic integrity of that building and to the extent that it's a contributing historic resource to the community. I think the conclusions, if you go over to behind the post office, and this property runs along the track, kind of abutting the hospital on the north side, it doesn't even resemble a packing house at this point. But that property has an application in. The property owners decided to sell it. They're moving their business, which was, I think, a cabinet-making business elsewhere in the city, as it turns out. And a company is buying that property and proposes to develop it. I think I got one more in me, so I need a break. One of the Route 66 specific plan's stated goals is to create more daytime jobs. How does the conversion of commercial property to high-density residential property help create more jobs? What kind of jobs do you expect? We are decreasing our capacity to host businesses while increasing our population. So this question, I think, if I can answer it, has to do with the wisdom of introducing residential into areas that historically have been commercial, and how does that help foster new jobs? And I think, again, I've sort of I'll try to restate this. The western part of the specific plan is oriented around housing, and the most intense area for housing and mixed use is around the future Gold Line station. The eastern section of the specific plan is all commercial, and it's all oriented around either sort of light industrial, community serving service type businesses or high-tech businesses. Up to this point, we have seen more interest from the development community, from private property owners and what they want to do with their property in the residential development part of it. The idea is that one of the ideas is that if you build more rooftops, that will ultimately lead to more economic activity. You'll have more people available to shop, more people looking for jobs. So that is the plan. I can tell you that from time to time, a lot of the bigger property owners on the East End are like, hey, will you please support me rezoning the property for residential? And we, from a staff level at least, we have said no. We want to maintain the specific plan the way it is. That division of commercial versus residential. Want to focus the commercial on the western end, and we're still, want to try to hopefully, some more commercial development occurs on the eastern end. And we hope that having those new rooftops, new people in the area will help support and incentivize people to see, hey, there's something going on in Glendora. It's a good place to invest. Better continuity or theme for architecture throughout the community. Good, I'll take that as a comment. Better design guidelines. And I know some of my commissioners wish we had more specific design guidelines for even our single family or multifamily areas. Be harder in the single family is my thought, but were the people who lived in the trailer park that were sold compensated?
Yes.
Yes, I don't, but not by the city. And the city was not, there was sort of compensation agreement reached, is my understanding. City was not a party to those negotiations. It was between the residents of the trailer park and the owner slash, I guess, development applicant, and they worked out whatever deal they worked out. But the city was not part of that process. Our role was simply to process the development application. I think the city planners and officials have done a very good job. If we get another good eatery, it will be well worth it. And I have to say that's one of the things I hear a lot. Actually, we do have a lot of restaurants in Glendora. It's amazing how many restaurants we do have. They're small ones. And I think a lot of people would wish some of the chain stores would come here. They see Olive Garden opening in San Diego. They say, golly gee, why can't we get an Olive Garden? A lot of that has to do with our location up against the foothills. I think, in terms of getting a chain store like an Olive Garden or something like that, probably more likely to happen down in the marketplace area. On Route 66, it's tough. Sort of the mom and pops sort of dominate that corridor. And again, having the people in the area that will support it is what those businesses are looking for. I'll do one more and then I'm going to take a break. Okay. We're almost hitting 9 o'clock. So how did the developer acquire the property? Was any redevelopment money used? I will say for those of you who are familiar with what a redevelopment agency was, the city of Glendora, like many communities throughout the state of California, had a redevelopment agency. And what a redevelopment agency is that it allowed you, gave you a financial tool to eliminate blight within the community through providing financial incentives, providing loans, acquiring property and assembling sites for development. I mean, if you want to know how Monrovia did it, because before I was in Glendora, I was in Monrovia, it was very active in using its redevelopment agency to acquire the property that you know as the Huntington Oaks Shopping Center. Pretty much everything east of Myrtle Avenue was acquired and assembled for Trammell Crow and other developers, Boone-Fetter, via the redevelopment agency. So that was a very important tool to create these development sites for jobs and restaurants that they were able to do. Well, in 2012, in the state's infinite wisdom, it eliminated redevelopment agencies. And so, Glendora was never really as active as a community like Monrovia with redevelopment. I think it wanted to be with the specific plan. But now we're strictly relying on zoning to incentivize people. We don't have the financial tools to assemble some old properties. We don't. So the question, was redevelopment money used? The short answer is no, because by the time a lot of these developments came along, the redevelopment wasn't a tool. But I will say that since about 2009, before redevelopment agencies sunsetted, the agency did acquire a few strategic parcels to try to facilitate development along the corridor. One of the properties that was purchased was a closed mobile home park on Route 66 next to the I'll call it the Gables project. It's the one that just got demolished. One of the parcels was an RDA acquired parcel, and it was purchased in order to say, hey, we've got this piece here. Are there other property owners? It would incentivize assembling a site large enough for development. That happened after the redevelopment agency was eliminated, but it was a tool that we had, and in that one case, we owned a property on Route 66 that ultimately became part of a development.
But the developer paid full market value for that parcel.
Right. They had to, they paid full market value for the property. I think a lot of people, there was no reduction in the price for some other something in exchange that redevelopment deals had to do. So I'm going to take a break.
Yes, please.
And actually, we're getting close to 9 o'clock.
The mayor's going to finish.
Okay, so I think I'm going to turn it over to the mayor. Okay.
Well, this has been sort of a heavy conversation, lots of information shared, and I want to thank all of you for coming, for paying attention, for asking your questions, for giving us your comments. It's been very valuable for us, and I hope it's been a very helpful meeting to you as well. I want to thank our staff for working hard to be able to impart information to you and to get your comments back. Thank you very much for the job you've done. I jotted down a few random comments as the meeting went on, and if you'll bear with me for just a minute. First of all, tonight's meeting is being videotaped. It will be available probably after tomorrow afternoon for you to go back and view on our website. And also Glendora City News is here, and they have been streaming it live, and it will be available on their page as well, their website as well. Speaking for your city council as your mayor, I want you to know that we truly appreciate your attendance and your comments. And if we didn't get through all of your comments tonight, we will look at them and review them in the future days. I don't presume to speak for other council members, but for myself, I want you to know that I do also have some concerns about the Route 66 specific plan. And as was mentioned, your council voted unanimously to stop and review the specific plan now with much public input as part of the process. I want to let you know, I'm sure you all do know this, but to urge you to participate in our formal meetings, our Planning Commission meetings and our City Council meetings. We welcome your attendance. We welcome your comments at those meetings. If you are not able to make them, and I know people really have very busy lives and it's difficult, and also the meetings run sort of long and you don't want to sit through all of it, you can watch those meetings live or you can go to them archived. And if you do the archived meeting, you can skip to the part you want. You don't have to go through the whole meeting. Just click on what you're interested in. If you'd like more information on the background of the developments that have been approved, Jeff, when did we start doing those reports at council meeting?
Probably, I think it was August, the first one?
Starting in August, and every single council meeting from then, a different project was reviewed in depth. And the last report was December?
December, first meeting in December.
First meeting of December was a 2-hour report on the Route 66 specific plan. So if you'd like more information, go back to those council meetings and you can watch them and get quite a bit more information. During the review process, we will very much rely on you to give us input. We can't do our job nearly as well without your input. So please, please participate. You'll be getting notices if you signed up on the email list, and we look forward to working with you. And it may be a very lengthy process, but we really hope you'll participate. Thank you very, very much. Oh, and your council, our job is to be available to you, and we try very hard to be available and responsive. So if you have comments following this meeting, we're here in the room. If you want to contact us a little bit later, please do. That's our job, and that's what we want to do. So thank you very, very much for coming.